Welcome. This is a workshop to help you get a story or poem written in time for the WestWords Living Stories competition. My name is Michelle Hamadache, and I'm Director of Creative Writing at Macquarie University. So some details of the competition to begin with. There is a prompt or a theme, and that is the other city. So today we're actually going to work through some different ways of approaching the theme. And of course, you may have ideas already to go, and hopefully this will still be a helpful workshop in terms of getting a story finished or a poem finished. As you can see from the flyer, entries close midnight, Sunday, the 30th of April. For all writers, deadlines are absolutely essential. So make sure that you take note of it and make sure that you get your story finished and entered on time. We will have various prompts. This is the adult workshop. So I do just want to say in advance, I've got some poems and some stories. A couple of them have, sort of more adult content in the sense that they deal with difficult cities and cities that have caused, sort of pain, as well as, sort of imaginary cities and all different types of cities. So I do just want to be really clear that this particular workshop is for an adult audience. And as I say, I do have a variety of prompts and exercises and also some examples of shorter poems and stories that hopefully will help you get a sense of what you might do for this competition. So I think it's really important to start with that idea of the prompt, which is the other city. And one of the things about prompts is that each of us will respond to it differently. It will say something different to each of us. And so while I have, some exercises and some images and some examples of poems and things, one of the really important things when dealing with a prompt or a theme is to really think about what it means for you, and then to trust that actually that's going to be a really good place to start a poem and to start a story. So I really do want to make that clear, that, I think when we're writing, when we're doing something creative, when we do have a sense of our own direction, it's important that we stick with it. So some of these prompts are going to be designed to help you maybe craft your idea if you already have an idea, or how to get it finished, or how to get it across the line. But of course, the other thing that I realize is that some of us really struggle with getting started. So some of the prompts are going to deal with that getting started. How can I even approach this idea? So I'm hoping that the approach will really work for as many of you as possible. That's definitely the goal. Remember, this story is 500 words if it's a story, and that's pretty short. And you've got to really think about that when you make decisions about how you approach the task, because if you're thinking War and Peace or Game of Thrones, it's not going to fit in 500 words. So I'll certainly talk us through some of the elements of tackling the 500 word, and the same with a 25-line poem. And I do have some examples of poems that are roughly around, sort of 20 to 25 lines, so that you can get a sense of the kinds of stuff that you can get done in that time. And once again, just to reiterate, Sunday, the 30th of April, because there's no point doing all of this work and then missing your deadline. And that link takes you to where you can upload your stories. So without further ado, let's get started on the exercises properly. So we do have some activities to get us started. We've also got some ideas about, sort of tackling that idea of the other city, what makes it other, sort of how we might, the different ways we might approach that, so that we have something that's sort of imaginative and our own and original. And then we'll sort of deal with working with the short story. So initially, it may feel as though we're mostly looking at poetry. But the reason I do that is because I think that, it's a really good way into a short story, even if you're not interested in writing poetry, because the 500 words is brief. And so we do need to pay attention to our words, making sure that every word is sort of packing a punch for us. And so poetry is a fantastic way into prose. And also some of you might start this thinking, I'm definitely writing a short story, and finish it thinking, no, I actually want to write a poem. So just so you do have a sense, it will kind of start with some sort of word and poetry kind of ideas, but we do move into the short story. So we are going to look at some getting started activities. So for those of you who just brim over with ideas, I don't want you to lose those ideas or think that those ideas aren't, sort of perfectly suited to the competition. But I am also mindful that some of us, sort of need a little bit more help getting started. And the thing that I do think is that if you have your ideas, these might still be exercises that help you perhaps sharpen your prose or your poem, or give you an unexpected windfall in terms of a first line or a first sentence. And also because, I think if we do love writing, or if we are interested in writing, remembering that we're actually sort of infinite wells. There's no limit to the number of stories we can come up with, or the number of poems that we come up with. So, sort of why not have a number of options in terms of, what you think you might submit, or also, stories that might actually end up in different places as well. So I think as writers, it's always good to try different activities, see if they work. Not all of them will. And I think that's the other thing to remember. Sometimes we go into writing exercises and, we might feel reluctant because they're not the way we usually approach writing. The great thing about this is that nobody is ever going to see your attempts except you. And so it can be interesting to see what your writing looks like when you do things that you don't ordinarily do. And also, I think as writers, as poets, it's important to be able to write badly, write a lot, and also just have fun, because ultimately, I think that a lot of the energy that comes from, sort of our writing and our creativity is because we enjoy it. And so, I do invite you to try these exercises playfully, even if some of them might feel a little unfamiliar or strange. So we are going to begin with some word pool exercises. Some of you may have done these before, and I actually think that these are sort of perennially useful. I think that there's never a point at which you've done enough word pools, because they always generate a different selection of words. And one of the things that I like about it is, there's a number of options in the way that you come up with word pools. So you can set yourself the idea of choosing a letter of the alphabet, like I, and then just listing as many words that begin with I. And when you look at that list of words, there'll be words that interest you. And I think for those of you who are poets, you can see how, sort of choosing to work with sort of a series of words that all begin with I, can then have a kind of a musical element, can introduce that phonic richness of, sort of consonants and, alliteration to your poetry, but also to your prose, because, sort of prose has moments of poetry in it as well. So there are different types of word pools. The one that we're going to do is quite specific to the WestWords theme of other cities. But, you know, as I say, I do want to give you that sense that you can do lots of different word pools and make them really work for you, especially when you're feeling stuck, or I think we all have days when our writing feels a little bit dull, a little bit uninspired, and we need something to spark it up a bit. And so sometimes just using words that we wouldn't choose consciously if we were actually sitting down to write something can help invigorate that prose. And also the specific word pools that I've given us for this, you know, for this prompt of other cities are really concentrated around nouns and verbs. And so this is probably something that I'll say a few times over the workshop. You know, a lot of the time, you know, we think that it's the adjectives and the adverbs, those sort of describing words, that makes our writing rich and, you know, sort of decorative and expressive. And actually, it's the nouns and the verbs, and finding really sort of precise nouns and really sort of sharp verbs, and cutting back on those adjectives and adverbs that will ultimately give us some really, you know, sort of vivid and, you know, sort of striking writing. So I think that that is something for us to sort of take away with us, that, you know, sort of concentrate energy on nouns and verbs rather than adjectives and adverbs. So what I want you to do is to put a piece of, you know, and actually I should have said, definitely have either your computer, your phone, or a notepad. And the beauty of these recorded as Zoom workshops is, of course, you can stop me at any point and go get, you know, sort of writing utensils, or just stop and take a breath. So if you haven't got a pad and paper or your computer, definitely go get it, come back. Because what I want you to do is to have that nice blank page, have the other city on top. And, you know, I want you to come up with, and I'm going to show you an example of mine, street names, places, parks, buildings. And, you know, so you can imagine just having a nice little column. And I don't want to show you mine just yet, because I'd like you to, you know, sort of start coming up with your own categories before I show you mine. So put the other city at the top of the page, and then, you know, sort of have street names, places, suburbs, anything to do with the city, and that you can think of that might be meaningful to you. Maybe it's buildings, you know, maybe it's an underpass, but I just want you to come up with a list. So I'm not going to pause because it's so easy for you to stop me. And I think it would just be a waste of, you know, sort of the 45 minutes if I was going to actually give you the time. But at this point, I would invite you to, you know, sort of press pause, or you can also wait, and I'm going to show you my word pool, which is quite listy, and then you can always stop and go back, because I want you to take some time to come up with street names and places and suburbs and cities, etc. So I will just take that off again before just sort of applying my categories. So as I say, pause me here, come up with some list names, and then I'm going to go through mine. Okay, so the reason I do want to go through mine just very, very briefly is because I think a lot of the time when people are writing, they're really reluctant to use the words that are really specific to them. Okay, they think, oh, you know, nobody will know Babazoa, nobody will know Via Pintoricchio, you know, nobody knows Alfred Street, or, you know, the Carl Expressway, or La Rue de Douche Mourad, or, you know, whatever. Okay, and so therefore we hold back these riches, you know, sort of these gems from the page, and then our writing kind of looks like everyone else's writing. Okay. And so what I kind of want to show you or invite you to sort of think about is the way that, things like Brookvale Hungry Jacks. So it doesn't have to be, sort of, fancy and somewhere, sort of far away. It can be somewhere really super close. But what I want to invite you to think about is the way that when you use, sort of proper nouns and specific places, they're kind of, even for the reader who doesn't necessarily know, sort of where where Arco Etrusco is, or where Rue Victor Hugo is, for example, the name itself kind of conjures a world. And remember that as readers, that's ultimately what we want, isn't it? We want we want to immerse ourselves in this experience on the page. Okay, and we don't have to know or have been or to understand every single element on the page. When we think about our love of, sort of for those of us who've loved fantasy fiction or science fiction, often it's the way, like a place like Zenobia, that doesn't exist, sort of might allure us, or Beaumaris. Where is Beaumaris? What kind of a place might it be? And then your reader is curious and invested, but also the place that you're describing feels real. And I think that's why I wanted to just spend a little bit of time encouraging you, when we think about that other city, to not be afraid of using, sort of really specific and precise language, because it's when you're dealing with short word counts like 500 words or, sort of 25 lines, actually every word has to be working super hard. And I think you can feel how, Corso Garibaldi or Elche or, sort of even, Soldiers Park. So how many parks are called Soldiers Park? And yet when you look at it on the page, it suddenly feels strange. And, why do we have so many memorials to war? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, there's all of these kinds of questions that come into play when we take, sort of specific and concrete details and work them into our stories. Now, all the way through, I want to, sort of, I guess, encourage you to take that prompt in the direction that works for you. So, for some of you, the other city could very well be, your particular neck of the woods, where you feel that because you live in a part of Sydney that you don't see very often in stories, or that, sort of there's just this neighborhood, or, sort of this little strip of shops that never ever ends up in the movies or in television series or whatever, or on the news, or in the big screenshots of Sydney, which is always, the harbour and the CBD or whatever. In many respects, that can be your other city. Likewise, I only had one fantasy city named Zenobia, but, like the other city, and you are invited in that prompt to make it something fantastical and imaginary. And we will look at ways of doing that. Or the thing that I want to say to you is that when you think about building your imaginary cities, in a sense, you're actually building them on the foundations of the real. So, if a real city is called Sydney, then your fantasy city also needs a name. If real cities have bridges, your fantasy cities have bridges, but maybe they're different. Maybe they don't have pylons. Okay, so that's kind of the way that, sort of your imagination works. You start off with sort of a nice strong base or a basis, and then you might transform it, or you might subtract something or add something, or, sort of embellish, or whatever it is. But what I really encourage you to do is start by getting some lists of places. And, if any one of those words or places makes you think, of a story, feel free to use mine. They're not mine. They're there for you. If they're there for anyone, but I do also encourage you to use your own list. So now we're going to move on to a word pool of verbs. Now, verbs are really important for our writing, and sometimes we, sort of limit how much we can use them. We don't realize their full potential because, we think we really only use it for people who are moving in some way. But actually, when we use our verbs to describe things and to describe cities and to describe places, then suddenly our prose or in our poems become more surprising and active and lively. So what I invite you to do now is to stop me and come up with your own list of verbs that you like. I'm going to show you my list of verbs. So, and you're always welcome to use these verbs. Sometimes it's fun to use somebody else's words. It's just like sometimes it's nice to have somebody else order dinner for you. Like sometimes you want to choose your own dinner, and sometimes you want somebody else to make the decisions for you. And you can do both as well, because this is a resource. You can stop it, start it, try it one way, do it a different way, and I really encourage you to do that. So this moment, we're really thinking about our verbs. And as I say, pause me, I'm not going to stop and come up with your own pool. So here are some of my verbs: stagger, shuck, plunge, swell, pinch, fossick. Like I think hound. So I didn't, I actually just put a timer on and said, here, Michelle, you've got 1 minute, come up with as many sort of verbs that sort of seem a little bit interesting as you can. And so, as I say, feel free to use my verbs or use your own list, because the next exercise is going to ask you to combine the two in a timed writing exercise. Okay. So as I say, if you need more time or you want to go back, you can. This is, as I say, the beauty of a resource. So we have a 5-minute writing exercise. Now, I really encourage you to use your clocks. Like you can see, I have my phone. I'm constantly turning to the timer and setting myself, 5-minute blocks, 10-minute blocks of writing. And it's not because that's the only way that I like to write. And it's not that it's the only sort of form of writing to do, but I think when we're either time poor, or also because when we have some kind of constraint, we often meet a different writer. And that's fun, because part of writing, I think, does invite, sort of the very many different selves that we carry around inside to sort of come to center stage. So I think when you put a timer on, some of you will hate it and you'll freeze and you'll go, no, I don't like this at all. Others of you, sort of will channel a voice that you weren't expecting. So when I say I want you to put a 5-minute timer on and write, I am quite literal about that 5 minutes. So the exercise is to choose 1 or 2 of the places on your word pool list of the city and use as many of your verbs to describe that city as you possibly can. Okay, so as I say, you can repeat this, you can read the instructions. Remember, it's not school, there's no punishments, nobody's checking to see how well it goes, but it is just a fun sort of invitation to see what happens when you write with the clock. Okay, so the idea of it is to choose 1 or 2 of the words. So, for example, I might have chosen Via Pinturicchio, and I might have, or I might have chosen Babazois, and, sort of then I might have said Babazois staggers, and so, of course, you've got this element of, sort of, I guess, there's an element of personification, but it just starts to get a little bit interesting when instead of, sort of describing, Babazois as an overcrowded, sort of city or like this. So this is why I'm sort of inviting you to match up, sort of strong, striking verbs with, sort of specific places to get some writing on the page. Because remember, this is all about warming up, getting some interesting, sort of words, phrases, sentences, maybe they're lines of poems, but, like this is us, I guess, sort of doing warm-up activities, for example. If you were going to hit the soccer field or sort of do some serious running, you would warm up. Okay. And the great thing about writing warm-ups is sometimes they come up with gems that actually become your story. So it's a kind of a win-win situation in many respects. And once again, I'm not stopping the clock. You stop the clock 5 minutes and come back to it. Now, the next thing that we're going to try in order to generate some writing for this prompt of the other city is using ekphrasis, which is basically just using images to write. Because the strange thing is that sometimes we put all of this focus and weight on ourselves as writers to have everything, sort of come from within, sort of the skull, sort of whatever we can conjure within our mind's eye. Sometimes when we have an image, and it doesn't have to be a painting or a, sort of a computer screen, I think also going out into the world and writing while you are sort of sitting on a train or in a coffee shop is another really great way to kind of fuel your creative process. And I do kind of encourage you to do that. Take a notepad. We've always got our phones. Next time you're on public transport or waiting for your coffee, jot down a few lines, because we also tap into our, sort of our different selves. When we sit down at the computer, we are often, sort of automatically switching into, sort of a particular mode of writing and a particular mode of thinking. And, it can often be quite repetitive, and it often, can often remind us of work, whereas when we step out of the office and away from the desk or away from our computer, and sort of are in the world, suddenly sort of we're a different writer. And so I do encourage you, especially for this prompt, when you're invited to think about the other city, to get into the city, sort of to actually be in your part of the city, or to travel to a different part of the city in order to come up with a story. But for those of us who are sort of desk bound for different reasons, or actually using images is a fantastic way of generating some ideas. So what I've got here is, once again, I've chosen some images. Any of you are, you're welcome to use these images, but I also exhort you to use your photos. I am really happy for you to sort of do your own Google searches and come up with images that speak to you, that when you look at them, suddenly stories start to emerge. And remember, they don't have to be panoramas. Sometimes it's hard to capture a panorama in words. Sometimes you want, sort of the alleyway, the corner, sort of the seat under, the tree, sort of under a tree, or the bus stop. And of course, because I do want you to also, I don't want you to feel as though there's only sort of social realism to write. Here are some images. That's actually Italo Calvino and Invisible Cities, an illustration of invisible cities. So, you can see that the other city can totally be imaginary and as wild and sort of as, sort of completely inventive as you like. But you can rewind, choose some of these, choose one of these images, maybe even try writing to all of the images and just see what happens. Or of course, go to your own photos and you sort of choose a photo, because photos are really powerful sort of ways of entering stories, because it often, sort of, it invites a particular type of focus, and the relationship between words and images, sort of music. Actually, another thing that I would say to you is definitely listening to music is an amazing way of getting stories written as well. So as you can see, I've just found some, sort of images. You can go back and forward, choose one, do your own. But once again, I invite you to do, a 5-minute writing exercise. If it works for you and, you're getting a story, then just continue. You don't have to take any notice of the timer when it goes off. But yeah, just see which of these images might inspire a story, or see which of your own images inspire a story. But it's got a name, ekphrasis. People have been doing it forever and a day. And yeah, so all you need to do is choose one of the images and allow yourself to have fun, because sometimes it's when you're not expecting your writing to work that it does work. And the other thing, I guess, that I do want to point out is, sometimes I think we read finished stories and we're so in awe of how this beautiful, sort of polished, sort of crafted story arose, that it prevents us from doing our own writing. And the thing to remember is that writing is rewriting. So you're ending up reading, sort of a finished product. But how many drafts went through? What did the first draft look like? Probably a lot more like your own first drafts. And so having that sense of getting a whole heap of words on the page and then going, phew, wow, now I've actually got something I can work with, that I can redraft, that I can cut and, sort of cut and paste and switch, sort of put the beginning at the end and the end at the beginning, or the middle at the beginning, and play around with and do cuts. Or now that I know that this is where the story ends, let me go back to the beginning and feed in some of those, sort of foreshadowing elements that are, sort of we always wonder, or we put too much pressure on ourselves to come up with at the beginning of our stories. Okay, because that's something that we do, is that we think, oh, I can feel that this first line isn't, sort of as good as X, Y, and Z. I need to keep working on it, without realizing that what often makes a first line or an opening, sort of unforgettable or fantastic, is the fact that the writer has written to the end, seen what's going on at the end, and then goes back to the beginning and kind of does that, sort of curation that makes it feel as though there was some kind of like magic or psychic quality that happens, that allowed sort of us to not know what's happening at the end, but the writer to know. So just remembering that getting messy words on the page and then being interested and sort of excited to sort of craft and sculpt and do that kind of work is a really important part of the process. So finally, this isn't a really simple exercise, but it can work so well because, sort of memory is humans are so constituted by our memories. We're drawn to our own memories. We're drawn to the memories of other people. There's often a richness when people talk about their memories. So I just ask you, as another writing exercise, to try completing each of these lines or coming up with your own. So I remember walking down. I remember the way the street sounded at midnight. Winter in. The smell of, I remember how hot X was in July, but just, sort of coming up with a long list of I remembers until you're completely exhausted and you've got no more I remembers left. And then have a look and see, is this in itself a poem? Because sometimes it will, sort of create, sort of a poem. And when you start a poem with the same line again and again and again, it's called an aphora. So it's an effective poetic technique. It's not necessarily to be avoided. But of course, you can also cut out the I remember. So you end up with walking down the street, the way the street sounded at midnight, the smell of, or just changing the order or cutting, sort of the lines that aren't interesting and leaving the ones that are. So once again, sort of hit pause, give yourself as long as you need to just go through. And remember that what we're really doing at this point is just generating writing, getting words on the page that are all linked and connected to that theme of the other city, okay? And sort of be interested and aware that if, for example, an idea takes off for you, stop. You can always come back to this tomorrow or never or at another time. Follow the story that happens for you, and sort of it's a gift. When a story arrives, especially when it's unexpected or it's come sort of from a prompt, you should definitely just sit and write it out. There's no right way of listening to this workshop. It's really there just to support you and get you writing. So if you if you end up with a story, job done. So and again, I'm not going to pause. Please pause me and do some writing. So now let's think about crafting a poem or a short story. Okay, so one of the things that I want to do is actually look at some examples of, sort of poems that have treated a city theme, just because I think sometimes we limit sort of ourselves unnecessarily, because we have sort of an idea of the way, oh, it must do this or it must tick this box or whatever. And it's funny because when we actually see how differently people approach a theme like the city, then we suddenly go, wow, actually it's an open page and it's an open invitation. And that's the other thing that I really want to make sure is that each of you are sort of keeping an ear out for the story of your own that's emerging out of all of this. Sort of maybe all of this is just simply writing exercises, but sort of you've got that shape of a story or the shape of a poem all ready to go. And hopefully you'll just be able to take little bits and pieces from this that will help you, sort of develop the story further than you might otherwise. So here are the three poems. City of Bones is an incredibly powerful poem, and I think that it's one that is a difficult one if you are at all sort of perhaps triggered by violence. So I do want to make that clear that there is sort of violence in it, but I also think that for those of us who sort of aren't sort of triggered by things like this, it's an incredibly powerful poem, and it's one that shows the way that sort of cities are different things for all of us. Okay, and I think that's really important to remember, is that there's not one way of representing a city, and in fact there are there are millions of cities around the world, and each of us will have interacted differently with those cities. Some cities make us feel at home, and there's no reason for them to make us feel at home. Okay, and other cities we forever feel outside of. And I think that is, or even within the city that we're at home with, there are places that we feel outside and as though we're excluded, and those kinds of energies are often quite powerful in our poems. So Bakanladi, Nigeria, City of Bones, and I think what we see is this way that there's cities, but sort of actually the city gets mapped onto the body. And remembering that when we are using our imagination and when we're making poems and metaphors, those kinds of moves away from the real, where the city becomes the body or the body becomes the city, often allow us to express things, sort of very profoundly. City of Birds, I think here, what we can see is we've taken a single moment, which is, sort of quite obviously, sort of the way crows have of, the way that crows have of essentially ripping open the garbage bins and spilling the garbage everywhere. And yet, because of the richness of language, because of the images that, I think you can close your eyes and you can kind of see these two sort of black things tussling, and we've got this visceral element to it, where once again, sort of the sort of the innards are sort of spilling, and then it becomes a poem because we have this transformation of sort of that which is kind of gross and abject and rubbish, and sort of the poem ends with sort of the joy of the crows, and so we have this lovely sort of a story that unfolds. Sort of there's a main character. It's a crow. It's struggling with its nemesis, which is a big black bag. What's going to win? Is it going to be the bag? Is it going to be the crow? Is it going to be the bag? Is it going to be the crow? Jubilation. The crow succeeds. The bag bursts, and sort of we've got our resolution. So I think sort of seeing how that maps across sort of the stanzas is another way of thinking how you might approach sort of your other city. Is there an animal? Is it a rat? Is it a seagull? Is it sort of is it the invasion of the cockroaches? Or I think that there's no limit to the ways that we can do this. And when we think about the lines of poems, I think what we're thinking about sort of the breath. Okay, we're thinking about what makes sense, because I think with poems, a little bit like our sentences, there's a natural length to the line, which is kind of where you might have your punctuation, even though these poems actually, by coincidence, none of them are using a lot of punctuation. The crows, not the city birds, no, and this city, no, but we've got punctuation in City of Bones. But what you're actually thinking is you're only sort of breaking away from that at points where you are, sort of wanting a particular effect. So, the city, I feel like we've got this very much a sort of a lockdown kind of moment there. And, sort of we've got, sort of this sort of city that's frozen in this moment, which is, sort of so powerful. And it's really sort of a series of images. And of course, poems can work by images. And you can sort of see how you could create a succession of images by having, the sort of the line from your verb and noun, and actually just choosing three of them as sort of the first lines of each stanza, and then just creating a sort of a full image based on that. And so there's so many ways of approaching sort of poems and sort of story prompts. A lot of the time you just need sort of like just a couple of ideas, and then your own mind kind of takes off with all of the sort of many possibilities. And it is, and it would be completely sort of original to use that idea of an animal, and do something sort of similar to the city birds, because remembering that poems and stories are always based on what went before, on sort of tradition and form and all of those sorts of things. And so trusting that you, and with your own original use of language and perspective and things like that, will create an original poem or story is really important. So now we're going to have a quick look at imaginary cities, because I don't want anybody thinking that everything has to be literal and social realism, because there's many wonderful things that you can do with the imagination. So this is Italo Calvino's Zenobia. And for those of you who love fantasy, I mean, it's got to start with a fantastic name, doesn't it? Like a name that makes you feel like you want to go there. So sort of you can see that in sort of Thin Cities Part 2, what Calvino is doing is he's first of all creating a city that looks like no city that any of us have ever seen before. And yet what we are exploring throughout Invisible Cities, which is the whole book, are things like memory and life and death. So, sort of try imagining an origin story for this city, your own origin story. Try sketching, sort of a city of your own imagination, and then writing how it came about, who lives there, its inhabitants. Because remember that 500 words isn't very long. So, sort of a really rich, sort of a richly imagined story of, sort of how a fantastical city came about could work quite well. Or invent the story of the end of your city, which can also invoke, sort of some really, sort of effective and surprising elements. Or another suggestion is actually using Sydney, your part of Sydney, and just changing something about it, add or subtract something. Like, what would Sydney be without the harbour, if it wasn't, sort of a seaside city? What would happen if you took away, if sort of Parramatta River just upped and went away one day? This is the stuff of the imagination. Or what if we shared streets with giant red belly black snakes? What would life look like if we introduced something like that? So remembering that fantasy can be, sort of fantastical in the sense that, you come up with cities that float in the sky and, sort of had an origin, based in storms or its own sort of little separate Big Bang. But stories can also, sort of fantastical stories can also occupy, sort of the real world and just shift one thing and everything changes. Who you are changes if you, sort of had to look twice before stepping out your front door because there were giant red belly black snakes everywhere. So really let loose the imagination, I think, is what I'm hoping to encourage you with this imaginary cities option. Now, this is an example of, sort of a short story that's, I think, roughly 500 words. This comes from Going Down Swinging, and you'll see that the poems had the link to Cordite Poetry Review, and these ones, this one has the link to Going Down Swinging. So I like this because I think that if you're struggling with a story, coming up with a nice little list and then writing to the list, you could think of 5 places and then just, sort of short, sharp observations, about each of those places can be a really sort of effective way of getting to your 500 words without going over, without, sort of ending up with a novel length sort of story. Or it also gives it a nice structure. And I think structure is really important when we're thinking about stories and poems as well. So, using the list from your word pool, or, sort of, I guess, starting, sort of with 5 pictures and just writing, sort of 5 prompts, sort of given, if you had 5 pictures of either parts of cities that you're interested in, and then you just kind of write 5 sections there, you could get a really nice story out of that. So obviously I'm not reading the poems out loud because there's not time in this tutorial, and I'm not reading the story out loud. But once again, I invite you to stop, read, and also do your own search for your sort of city stories. But you can see how concrete it is, backyard clovers, nectars, park, corduroy, bird, like the sort of the words themselves are going to generate stories for you. So words are really fantastic like that. If we get some, sort of nice, concrete, evocative words on a page, generally speaking, our brain will pick up the, sort of pick up and do what it needs to do and tell us a story, because we are wired to tell stories. And I think that's something else. We do it every single day. Every time we sit down next to somebody on a bus and we tell them, sort of about our day, or when we arrive at work and, sort of we create suspense by saying, well, I nearly missed the bus, and sort of we don't let them know that we did actually get the bus until the very end of the story. We're totally natural storytellers, and so I really want you to sort of have that sense of confidence in your ability to tell stories, and sort of and then it's just a question of sort of stepping back and taking bits and pieces from maybe this that helps you to get something ready for a prompt like the other city. So don't forget to think about characters. Characters are really important. Now, this is something that I want to sort of say. When you only have 500 words, you can't have a lot of characters because there's just not time. Okay, so some of the work that writers do happens off the page. Okay, so knowing your story character, knowing your story and knowing your character is kind of your work. It's like your homework as a writer. And once you know that, then you pick up the pen and you write with that sense of confidence and that sense of, sort of, I guess, being master of your world. So some questions about characters. This is to help you, sort of think about shaping stories around characters. First of all, who lives in your city? So the questions that follow here, when I say describe them physically, clothes matter. Like there's a world of difference. Somebody who wears high tops versus somebody who wears, sort of loafers versus somebody who wears, like hoodies versus, like there's just clothes mean things. They have metaphoric power on the page. So use your clothes strategically, but sort of the describing physically, knowing their family, their language, their languages, their occupations or lack of, their likes, dislikes. Not all of that is necessarily going to find its way into your story. And in fact, I suggest it won't when you've got 500 words. Okay. But if you know that about your character, then you're going to write them better. And you're going to have more options for them when they get into the story. And don't forget that a lot of great fiction, or the stories that we think of as fiction, are really based on people that writers have known that they then kind of co-opt into their story world. So don't be afraid to just base a character on somebody you know or yourself, because you will then know all of that stuff about their likes and their dislikes and their languages and their family and, all of that sort of stuff. So I guess it kind of saves you doing that background work if you don't like that idea of things. Really important, because when you're thinking about what makes a story feel like a story, it's because something's happened. It's not boring. It's not just a meditation. It's just not ponderous, meandering, sort of words on a page. Like we all get impatient with that kind of writing. Have something happen. So think about it, what your character wants at the beginning. Maybe it's just to get to work on time. Maybe it's to, sort of meet the love of their life. Maybe it's to get, sort of to get a brioche while it's still warm. Like those kinds of things. Be really concrete about what a character wants. And then think about what the character will want at the end of the story. So by the time that they get to the brioche shop, the brioche is cold, and what the character comes to realize is that it wasn't the warm brioche they wanted. What they really wanted was a hug, or they wished that their, sort of their mother or spouse or somebody was there to comfort them, and so then you've got this sort of discovery where the obsession is about getting this brioche while it's still warm. No, everything gets in the way. Sort of the trains are late. Sort of somebody stops to ask for directions. Somebody else needs to borrow a phone. The brioches are getting cold. They're getting cold. They get their brioches aren't just cold, they're gone. And then, the character is so bereft and they realize, well, wow, it wasn't all about the brioche. It was actually that, they just wanted, to be comforted in some way. So it's that kind of thinking that happens in stories. And of course, you don't have to write about brioches, but that's just kind of an illustration. And then importantly, what goes wrong for your character in the story. For a story to work, you need conflict, struggle, disappointment, defeat, obstacles. They can be big, they can be small, they should matter to your character. And that's what I mean. Like when I talk about conflict, it doesn't have to be, sort of the descent of the aliens or whatever, although maybe that's what you want. But it needs to matter to your character. So it can be something small if it's important to your character. Okay. And so even if you want a story with a happy ending, it's not a happy ending unless there's some suffering. Like humans are terrible. We don't want to read, happy, 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 happy. If we want happiness, we have to experience sadness and disappointment and concern for the character that it's not going to work out for them. So that also gives you this nice sort of structure. What am I going to do? I'm going to have a character who wants something, they're not going to get it. And then at the end, sort of they're going to change their tack, or, something that unexpected happens that moves them into a different place. So this all happens in a really sort of efficient and economic way in 500 words. Maybe the other thing that happens is you write it and the story is 1,000 words, and then you actually just cut maybe the whole opening section. So it's a little bit more enigmatic. So it's a little bit more mysterious. And because when you have 500 words, a little bit like poetry, you can expect your reader to work a bit harder. So the longer the story and the more stamina that it takes to read, then the more that you kind of have to give your reader a hand. But the shorter the work, the more that you can ask a reader to sort of do a little bit of thinking about what this situation might be, where this story is going, what it was meaning. Okay, so just be prepared to write more and then cut. And the ways that you can cut is just cut an opening section, or cut an ending section, or cut a middle section, like just cut whole paragraphs and then make it work. Okay. Another way you can do it is just get rid of every single adjective and adverb, and your conjunctions like your ands and everything, so it'll get really stentorian and abrupt. But then you look at it and you go, I like this one here. I'll craft and add a few more adjectives and adverbs, and then we'll get a little bit more of the sort of, I do want to have a few conjunctions back in so that not all of my sentences are robotic, but those kinds of exercises tend to give you a really sort of lively prose that just has that kind of X factor. And ultimately, sort of, especially when you're writing for a competition, you want your prose to have a bit of an X factor. And so even though it's work and it's quite exhausting, it's worth it, because it also makes your writing look a little bit strange to yourself. And then you see the potential of, sort of new ways of telling stories, or, sort of writing poems and getting rid of the fluff, or, sort of all of the filler words that don't actually do anything for you, but, sort of you just get into the habit of using. So once again, I've just picked some random images. You feel free to use your own. Once again, I highly recommend using your own sort of photographs, but at the same time, sometimes, a photo will just take you by, sort of surprise, and you think, yeah, I could write to that. So feel free to use these, or as I say, just get your own photos, Google them, or look out the window. Sort of the people around us are interesting. And I think that's something to remember about writers. Writers are interested in the people around them. Even if we're not, even if we're quiet and retiring types who don't actually talk to the people around us, we're often interested in the people around us. So here are just some situations. Okay, because, like when we think about characters, what we actually want is, sort of characters in action, characters, sort of engaging with other characters, relations, things about to happen, things that have just happened. And so, you can see in these, there's just sort of twos, because remember, I'm thinking in terms of 500 words, it's not a lot. And so once again, feel free to write, sort of what happens next, or what just happened, or, sort of just let your imagination run riot with these images, or find your own. But what I want you to think about is, I do want you to think about creating a single scene, like when we get a sense of a place, when we get a sense of what time it is in the day, like, oh, it's 9 o'clock in the morning, because, sort of the world at 9 a.m. is a different world to the world at 10 p.m., is a different world to the world at 2 p.m. And that's, sort of, or 2 a.m. And, sort of writers are aware of those, sort of important changes. It's like we're so sensitive to the world, we can feel it on our skin. And so thinking about, the time that this scene is happening, what the world is at that moment in time. And then, sort of creating a scene that unfolds in time, sort of taking, the whole, maybe in your mind, you go, this whole scene is just 1 minute. Okay, getting back to that idea of humans are completely and utterly tyrannized by time. Like we grow older with every second. Our days are always filled. We've got work commitments, family commitments. We know how important time is, and how it exerts pressure and stress on us as humans. And as writers, we kind of introduce some of that into our stories. And we do that by being precise about time, by having a bus that is going to leave, sort of at 11 a.m., whether you're there or not, sort of having a deadline like the 30th of, I think it was, I'm not good with dates, but I think it was the 30th of April, whether you submit or not, that deadline is there. So sort of use those kinds of elements in your stories to generate energy and tension and conflict and anxiety, because that's all the stuff that makes readers read. So 500 words, it's not very long. Keep to 1 to 2 characters. If you are going to do something with more, then really think about vignette style, like little cameos where they make a super short appearance, and you're really clear with your structure. I think there's a story, Dressing Up for the Carnival by Carol Shields, where she has too long for you, but like for the 500 words, but it's that kind of structure. Keep your plot short, sweet, simple. Like you can't have a Game of Thrones style plot unfolding in 500 words because it'll be a disaster. Like it'll just be a mess. It'll be all plot, no story, no character, no scene, no setting, no meaning, no city, no other city, let alone, our city. So just keep a nice, simple plot. And sort of maybe it's just a part of a story, like it's just a sliver, like we just get this glimpse of this moment, that unfolds at sort of 7 a.m. between sort of joggers or whatever. Cut your adjectives and adverbs because they clog your drain pipes. Okay, there's no other way of saying it. Occasionally you need adjectives and adverbs because they have a rhythmic quality to them, or sometimes they'll introduce a particular tone, but 9 times out of 10, you just don't need them. And you're much better going for precise nouns, sort of Bumares instead of, town, Via Pinturicchio instead of the street, that kind of thing. Think one scene, characters walk in, something happens, characters walk out. Dialogue. If you have dialogue, keep it short, sharp, and punchy, make it count. Use the language that you speak. Okay, it's really important that you don't have a sense that you need to use posh or, sort of archaic language. Make it the language of today, this moment. And think about breaking rules, because breaking rules in stories makes your dialogue come alive. So one person is talking about, sort of how heartbroken they are, and the other person ignores them. Or one person is telling, sort of this story about how heartbroken they are, and the other person says, so did you catch up with, sort of Married at First Sight last night? It's those kinds of jarring interactions in dialogue that will often give your dialogue a little bit of zing, a little bit of energy. Sort of somebody who says the opposite of what they mean. So don't let your dialogue be flat or just there because you think, oh, I've had a scene, so now I better put some dialogue in. Make your dialogue count, make it full of tension and conflict and surprise or humor or whatever it is. Or something that changes the stakes, changes the game. Like if everybody's really focused on, sort of what the boss is going to say, and then somebody walks in and says, I'm the new boss. Well, boom, everything that's gone before suddenly has shifted and it doesn't matter. Okay, so just thinking strategically, get your words on the page, okay, which is what we did. We got words, we got lists, we got ideas, we got a number of different ideas. Some of them will have legs, some of them won't have legs. Try them all, try some of them, try none of them. Stick with your story, it doesn't matter. But you just sort of then think through some of these ideas so that you can ask yourself, is my story or poem working? So final tips, make your title count. Short, snappy, memorable, striking, meaningful, original, colourful, beguiling. Don't let it be a wasted moment. Nothing should be a wasted moment. Don't be afraid to lose that first paragraph or stanza. Often it's the one we needed to get our story started. We're fond of it because we're so grateful. Thank you that I got words on the page. 9 times out of 10, it can go. And the great thing about working in Word is you can cut it out. If it needs to go back, you just paste it back in. Try to say one real thing. Write about something that matters to you. You know, like, what is the point of all of this, you know, if we're not saying something that matters? All right. First lines, last lines, whether you're writing poetry or prose, should be perfect. If you've got a clunky, convoluted, you know, sort of clause-ridden opening sentence that you're only just in control of, cut it, because the reader doesn't want to wade through that. You know, you have to be in perfect control of your opening sentences and your last sentences. If that means short and sweet and simple, make it so. But don't, you know, sort of don't get tangled up in, you know, sort of your grammar in your first sentences. You shouldn't get tangled. You want to avoid that at all costs, but most particularly so. And what I notice is it often happens in first sentences because we're not quite comfortable in the story, and then we agonize over it, and then we don't think about the simple and obvious solution, which is just to cut it or just start again. So I'm admonishing you, just get rid of it if it's not working. And I think the most important thing of all, you know, sort of the real key to anything, I think, is writing for the love of writing, not for winning competitions. Because I think that there will always be a different quality to your story if you're sort of writing for that love of writing. So thank you so much for joining me today and listening to this. And I hope that there were lots of helpful tips, and I wish you all luck with the competition. Thank you.